The dress had cost 3 winters of savings. Lily knew this because she was the one who had tucked each coin into the hollow behind the loose brick near the fireplace, and she was the one who had walked to the village seamstress with the fabric folded under her arm, a sand-colored linen she had found at the market for a price that still made her stomach tighten when she thought about it. It wasn't silk. It wasn't the kind of thing the Beta daughters wore to recognition ceremonies, but it was the best she had, and Mara had sewn every stitch with such care that under the light of the torches, it looked almost noble. "You look beautiful," Mara had said when she finished, adjusting the thin leather belt at Lily's waist, with fingers made quick by years of needlework. "He's going to see you. This time he's really going to see you." Lily hadn't answered. She had only looked at the imperfect reflection the polished metal mirror returned. A woman of 23, blonde, with a long braid falling over one shoulder, cheeks flushed from the cold night air slipping through the cabin window. She was not a great beauty by court standards. But there was something in her eyes, a color between gray and green that Mara always said looked like the sky before rain. And men sometimes stopped to look twice without quite knowing why. The recognition ritual of the Grey North Pack happened once a year, in the great stone hall at the center of Ashvale, on the night when the first frost covered the ground and the torches burned amber instead of gold. It was the night when wolves of age declared their bonds, their allegiances, and their chosen. It was the night when a man could stand before his pack and name the woman he intended to keep at his side. Owen had told her he would name her. He had said it in the forest, 3 weeks ago, with his hand resting against the bark of an old pine, and his eyes carrying that particular warmth she had spent 2 years convincing herself was real. He was a mid-rank Beta, son of the pack's Eastern Territory keeper, handsome enough that other women noticed when he walked into a room. He had never been the kind of man who belonged to someone like Lily, an Omega with no family name worth mentioning, no blood ties to any respected lineage, a woman who survived by helping the pack healer gather roots and prepare remedies in exchange for a place to sleep and a bowl of broth each morning. But he had looked at her in that forest and said the words she had been afraid to want. "I'm going to choose you, Lily, in front of everyone." She had believed him. That was the part that would stay with her longest. Not the humiliation that came after, but the fact that she had believed him so completely, so willingly, that she had sewn a dress and braided her hair, and walked into that hall with her chin level and her heart open like a window in summer. The Hall of Ashvale was ancient, built from dark stone that absorbed the torchlight and gave it back in warm, uneven flickers. Long banners hung from the rafters. The gray wolf on black cloth, the colors of the northern pack. And the smell of the place hit her the moment she crossed the threshold. Resin burning in iron bowls, pine smoke, mead being poured from heavy pitchers, leather and fur and the deep animal warmth of hundreds of wolves gathered in one place. Long tables ran the length of the hall, packed with pack members who had dressed in their finest. At the far end, the elders' platform stood raised above the crowd, where the recognition declarations would be made before the entire Alcatia. Mara appeared at her side almost immediately, linking their arms together with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing it since they were girls. "You're gripping your own hands," Mara murmured, nodding toward Lily's fingers, which had twisted together in front of her stomach. "Stop it. You look nervous." "I am nervous." "Well, look like you're not." Lily exhaled slowly and let her hands fall to her sides. She scanned the hall without turning her head, the way she had learned to observe without appearing to observe, a skill that came naturally to Omegas who had spent their lives trying not to draw the wrong kind of attention. She found Owen near the eastern pillar, standing with a group of Beta males, a cup in his hand, laughing at something one of them had said. He was wearing a new vest. His hair was combed back. He looked, she thought, like a man preparing to do something important. He hadn't looked in her direction yet. That was fine. The declarations didn't begin until the elder rang the bone bell. She and Mara found a place to stand near the side wall, close enough to the platform to hear clearly, but far enough from the main tables that they weren't crowding the senior pack members. A girl brought them cups of warm spiced cider, not mead, which was reserved for those with declared status, and Lily wrapped both hands around hers and let the heat travel up through her palms. The smell of cinnamon bark and dried berries helped steady her breathing. The bone bell rang. The hall quieted in the way that large rooms quiet when everyone has been waiting for the same signal. Not silence exactly, but a collective holding of breath. The elder, a broad woman named Selva, with white streaked hair and the kind of face that had seen 5 decades of pack politics, stepped to the front of the platform and raised one hand. The declarations began. One by one, wolves stepped forward. Bonds were named, pairs acknowledged. The hall responded to each with a low, resonant sound. Not quite applause, more like the vibration of recognition passing through a crowd that shared the same blood and the same land. Lily watched each declaration with a calm she was manufacturing deliberately, breath by breath, sip by sip of cider that was going cold in her hands. Owen stepped forward when his name was called. She felt Mara's hand tighten on her arm. Owen stood on the platform with his shoulders straight and his chin up, and for one moment, one terrible, suspended moment, his eyes found hers across the hall. She saw something move through his expression. Not warmth. Something more complicated than warmth. Something that looked, if she was honest with herself later, like apology. Then he looked away. "I declare my bond," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. "To Senna of the Eastern Ridge." The name landed in Lily's chest like a stone dropped into still water. She felt the ripple of it move outward through her ribs, her throat, the backs of her eyes. Senna was the territory keeper's niece. She had status. She had land attached to her name. She was exactly the kind of woman an ambitious Beta chose when he decided that what he had promised in a forest 3 weeks ago was a liability he could no longer afford. The hall made its sound of recognition. No one looked at Lily. Or perhaps everyone did. She couldn't tell anymore, because she had fixed her gaze on a specific stone in the wall across from her, and she was counting its edges, 1, 2, 3, 4, while she waited for her face to remember how to be still. Mara said nothing. She simply kept her hand on Lily's arm, steady and quiet, which was the only thing in that moment that felt real. Lily set her cup of cold cider down on the nearest surface. She adjusted the belt of the dress that had cost 3 winters of savings. She lifted her chin, and she walked toward the door. She was almost there. She could smell the cold night air coming through the gap in the heavy oak panels, could feel the promise of darkness and empty road, and the particular dignity of leaving before she broke, when the doors opened from the outside. Not one man. 3. They entered the hall the way that men of genuine power enter rooms, without announcement, without urgency, but with a weight that rearranged the air around them. The crowd nearest the entrance stepped back, without appearing to decide to. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. The elder on the platform looked up. The first was broad and copper-haired, with a crooked grin already forming on his face as he scanned the hall like a man arriving to a feast he'd been anticipating. The second was leaner, dark-eyed, with an ironic tilt to his mouth that suggested he found most of what he observed mildly amusing, and was polite enough not to say so directly. The third one walked between them and slightly ahead, which no one seemed to have arranged, but which felt entirely natural. He was tall in the way that made the ceiling of the hall seem lower. Black braids pulled back from a face that was all clean angles and controlled stillness, with eyes the color of deep water under winter ice, pale, clear, and completely unreadable. He wore dark leather and a manto of black fur across his shoulders, cross straps over his chest, and he moved through the parting crowd with the unhurried certainty of someone who had never once in his life needed to announce his own arrival. Lily recognized the crest on his chest strap a half-second before her mind fully processed what it meant. The black wolf on silver ground, the crest of the Iron Veil King. His name moved through the hall in a whisper that built like wind before a storm. Roman. And he had stopped walking. He had stopped walking because his eyes had found her, standing alone near the door in her sand-colored linen dress, chin up, expression carefully composed, one hand resting against the wall, as if she needed it for balance but would never admit it. He looked at her for a long moment. Not the way Owen had looked at her, with the complicated guilt of a man who had already made his decision. Roman looked at her the way a wolf looks at something it has caught the scent of from a great distance, and finally, after a long time, found the source. Quiet, certain, unhurried. Then the corner of his mouth moved, barely, just a fraction, and he took one step in her direction. Lily did not move. This was partly because her legs had made the decision for her, and partly because something deeper than instinct, something that lived below thought, in the part of her that was wolf before it was woman, had registered the weight of that gaze and gone completely still in response. Not from fear, from something she didn't have a name for yet, something that felt uncomfortably like recognition. The copper-haired man reached her first. "Well," he said, stopping an arm's length away with that crooked grin widening. "This is the most interesting thing I've seen since we crossed the northern border. Caden," he added, as if she had asked, extending one hand with the casual confidence of someone who had never once been ignored. "And before you ask, yes, we're aware we weren't formally invited." "No one said that," Lily replied, because her mouth had decided to work before her better judgment could intervene. Caden blinked, then laughed, a genuine sound surprised out of him. "She's quick," he said, turning his head toward the dark-eyed man beside him. "I noticed," the second man said, with that ironic tilt still in place. His voice was lower, more deliberate. "Stellan, also uninvited." He paused. "You were leaving." It wasn't a question. He had observed it the way perceptive people observe things, not intrusively, but with the calm accuracy of someone who misses very little. "I was," Lily said. "And now?" She didn't answer that, because she didn't have an answer that wouldn't reveal too much. Instead, she made herself look at the third man, the one who had stopped walking when he saw her, and had not yet said a single word. He was closer now, close enough that she could detect the scent that came off him beneath the pine smoke and leather of the hall. Something cold and mineral, like stone after rain, with a dark undercurrent that her wolf recognized as pure, concentrated alpha. It pressed against her senses without being aggressive. That was the strangest part. A man carrying that much dominance should have felt like pressure, like the air before a storm when it becomes difficult to breathe easily. Instead, it felt like weight. The specific grounding weight of something immovable standing between her and everything behind her. Roman looked at her without speaking. Up close, his eyes were even more unsettling, not because they were cold, but because they were the opposite of cold. There was something very awake behind that controlled stillness, something that was measuring and present in equal amounts. "You're an Omega," he said finally. His voice was low and even, not a question. "Yes," she said. "From this pack?" "Attached to it." She kept her chin level. "I assist the healer." Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly. More like a piece of information slotting into a place where it had already left an outline. "You're sent," he said, and then stopped himself, which was more interesting than if he had continued. He looked at her for another moment, then turned his gaze to the hall behind her, where the recognition ritual had resumed in a slightly strained fashion, the entire pack attempting to behave as though the Ironvale King had not just walked in and stopped in front of an unranked Omega near the exit. Caden leaned toward Stellan and said something at a volume clearly designed to be heard. 10 silver coins says he doesn't move from this spot for the rest of the evening." "I'm not taking that bet," Stellan said. Lily felt the warmth rise in her face and was grateful for the dim torchlight. "You don't have to stay," she said to Roman, because it felt important to establish that she was not the kind of woman who collected attention she hadn't earned and then clung to it. "I'm sure the elder would like to formally receive you." "Selva can wait," Roman said, with the particular ease of a man who has never had to worry about whether a sentence like that was appropriate. From the platform, as if summoned by the mention of her name, Elder Selva's sharp eyes had found the group near the door. Lily watched the older woman's expression cycle through surprise, calculation, and carefully composed welcome in the span of about 3 seconds. Selva was, above all things, a pragmatist. The copper-haired Caden had already turned to survey the room with the alert curiosity of a man cataloging everything for future use. His eyes landed briefly on Owen, who was standing near the eastern pillar with Senna at his side, and an expression on his face that Lily recognized as the particular discomfort of a man who has recently done something he is already reconsidering. "Someone hurt you tonight," Caden said, not looking at her, his tone shifting from easy charm to something quieter. It wasn't an accusation. It was simply an observation stated plainly, the way people who have seen a great deal of the world sometimes speak. Lily said nothing. "That man," he continued, still not looking at her, "made a promise he didn't keep." "It happens," she said. "It does," Caden agreed. "It shouldn't, but it does." He turned back to her then, and the grin was gone, replaced by something more honest. For what it's worth, he looked like a man who already knows he made the wrong choice. "It isn't worth much," Lily said. "But thank you." Stellan made a small sound that might have been approval. Roman had not participated in this exchange. He had been watching the hall, or appearing to watch the hall, with that quality of attention that suggested he was simultaneously present in the immediate conversation and processing something entirely separate. When he looked back at her, there was a directness to it that she found difficult to hold, and more difficult to look away from. "How long have you been with this pack?" he asked. 4 years. "Before that?" She hesitated. "Traveling." "Alone?" "Mostly." He absorbed this without comment. Then, "Where did you travel from?" The question was quiet, but it had an edge to it. Not unkind. More like the edge of something precise. Like he was asking because the answer mattered, though she couldn't imagine why her origin would be of any consequence to the King of Iron Vale. "The Western Territories," she said carefully, "near the old river border." Something changed in his face. It was small enough that she might have imagined it, a slight tightening around the eyes, a fractional shift in the set of his jaw. But she didn't think she imagined it, and she didn't know what it meant. Before she could decide whether to ask, a commotion near the hall's side entrance drew attention. A pack soldier, one of the Grey North's border guards, still in travel-dusty armor, pushed through the crowd with the controlled urgency of someone delivering news that cannot wait. He reached Elder Selva on the platform, bent to speak low into her ear, and Selva's expression went rigid in a way that made the nearest pack members step back instinctively. Selva looked up. Her eyes found Roman. "My king," she said, her voice cutting through the hall's resumed murmur with the authority of decades. "There is news from the river crossing. Your advance scout." She paused. "He didn't make it back to camp." The shift in Roman was immediate and total. Not panic. Nothing so ungoverned as that. But the stillness that had been calm became something else. Focused, edged, ready. He turned toward Selva with his full attention. "Which crossing?" he asked. "The Ashfin Narrows," Selva said. "The current has been violent this week. 3 days of upriver rain." Caden and Stellan had both straightened. The easy manner was gone. In its place was something that reminded Lily that these men, whatever else they were warriors first. "I know the Ashfin Narrows," Lily said. All three of them looked at her. She hadn't planned to speak, but the words were already out. And she had spent enough years walking alone through the Western Territories to know that the Ashfin Narrows in late autumn, after 3 days of rain, were not something an unfamiliar scout survived without local knowledge of the current patterns. She had crossed them twice. She knew where the water ran false, where it looked shallow and moved fast, but hid the deep pull beneath. "I know where the current traps," she continued, keeping her voice steady. "There's a section where the water folds back on itself beneath the surface. It doesn't look dangerous from the bank. It is." Roman was looking at her with that complete, unhurried attention again. "You've crossed it," he said. "Twice. Once in autumn, once in early winter." She met his gaze. "If your scout went in at the Narrows, there's a gravel shelf 40 paces downstream on the eastern bank. The current deposits things there. It's where I would look first." Silence. Then Roman turned to Caden and said one word. "Horses." Caden moved immediately. Stellan was already halfway to the door. Roman looked back at Lily one final time. There was something in his expression that she couldn't fully read, something between assessment and a decision already made. "Come with us," he said. It was not a command. It was not a request either. It occupied the space between the two with the ease of a man who rarely needed to repeat himself. Behind her, somewhere in the warm, torch-lit hall that smelled of resin and mead, and the pack that had never quite claimed her as its own, Owen was standing next to a woman whose name carried weight and land and status. Lily looked at Roman. "Let me get my cloak," she said. The night was the kind of cold that had teeth. Lily pulled her gray cloak tighter as her horse followed the path Roman's men had taken toward the river, the trees closing around them like walls as they left Ashvale behind. The forest smelled of wet bark and frozen earth, and the torches the soldiers carried ahead threw orange light that made the shadows between the pines move like living things. She had ridden enough in her years of traveling to keep her seat without trouble, but the horse they had given her was larger than anything she was accustomed to, a dark animal with a broad chest that moved through the undergrowth with the certainty of something that had done this many times before. Roman rode slightly ahead of her. He had not spoken since they left the hall. Caden, to her left, had no such restraint. "So," he said, keeping his voice low enough not to carry to the soldiers ahead, "you just walked out of a recognition ritual where some beta publicly humiliated you, and now you're riding through a dark forest with 3 strangers to find a missing scout at a dangerous river crossing." He paused. Most women would have gone home and cried into their pillow. "I don't have much of a pillow," Lily said. Caden stared at her for a moment. Then that grin reappeared, wider than before. "I genuinely like you," he announced, as if this were information she had been waiting for. "Caden," Stellan said from her right, his tone carrying the specific weariness of someone who had been managing the same person for a very long time. "She doesn't need your commentary." "I'm providing atmosphere," Caden said. "You're providing noise." Lily kept her eyes on the path ahead, but something in her chest had loosened slightly. Just a fraction. Just enough. The banter was familiar in the way that ordinary human things are familiar when everything else has gone strange, and she was grateful for it without quite knowing how to say so. The Ashfin Narrows announced themselves first through sound, a low, continuous roar that built beneath the wind as they descended toward the riverbank. Lily had forgotten, in the years since she had crossed it, how loud the Ashfin was at this time of year. The rain had done its work. When they broke through the last line of trees and the river came into view, she understood immediately why the scout hadn't made it back. The water was black and fast and enormous. What she remembered as a river of moderate width had swallowed both its banks and was moving with the muscular. indifferent force of something that had stopped caring about the things in its path. Branches and debris rode the surface at speed. The sound of it was not quite a roar. It was deeper than that, more like the sustained note of something very large breathing. Roman's horse stopped at the bank's edge. He sat looking at the water with that focused stillness, the torchlight catching the angles of his face. "The gravel shelf," he said, without turning. "Where?" Lily urged her horse forward until she was beside him. She looked downstream, orienting herself by the shape of the far bank and the curve of the tree line. "There," she said, pointing to the right. "Past that fallen pine that's caught against the eastern bank. The current runs hard against the bend and deposits on the inside of the curve. 40 paces, maybe 50 at this water level." Roman looked where she pointed. Then he dismounted in a single clean motion and handed his reins to the nearest soldier. "My king," Stellan said immediately, and there was something in his voice that suggested this was a familiar argument. "Send the men." "The men don't know the shelf," Roman said. "Neither do you." "She does," Roman said, and looked at Lily. Everyone looked at Lily. She dismounted before she had consciously decided to. Her boots found the frozen mud of the bank, and she took a moment to read the water the way her years of solitary travel had taught her. Not the surface, which was chaos, but the movement beneath it, the way the current organized itself around obstacles, the places where the water's behavior revealed what was underneath. "Stay close to the eastern bank," she said, moving downstream along the edge. "The current runs false in the middle. It looks slower, but it's deeper, and it pulls. The safe line is within 4 paces of the bank." She was aware of Roman moving behind her, matching her pace. The soldiers followed at a slight distance, torches raised. The fallen pine came into view. A massive old tree that had come down sometime in the last storm, its root ball still half attached to the bank, its length stretching out into the water at an angle that created a partial barrier against the main current. And there, caught in the shelter of that barrier, snagged against the gravel shelf she had described, was a man. He was face up, which was the first good sign. His arm had hooked around one of the pine's submerged branches, which was the second. He was not moving, which was not a sign in either direction yet. In water this cold, stillness could mean unconscious, or it could mean something worse. "He's breathing," Lily said, before anyone else had processed what they were seeing. She had already read the rise and fall of the man's chest in the torchlight. Shallow, but present. "He's caught on the branch. If someone pulls him from the wrong angle, the current will take him again." She was already moving toward the fallen pine, stepping onto its partially submerged trunk with the careful balance of someone who had crossed worse. "Wait," Roman said, his hand finding her arm. Not gripping, just present. A contact that asked rather than ordered. "The approach angle matters," she said, not stopping but slowing. "If you send a large man in heavy armor out on that trunk, the weight distribution changes and the whole thing shifts." She looked back at him. "I'm lighter. I know where the shelf holds." A long moment. His eyes on hers in the torchlight. That pale winter watercolor, reading her with that infuriating and oddly comforting thoroughness. "Caden," he said. "With her. Stay on the trunk." Caden appeared at her side immediately, the grin entirely gone now, replaced by a competence that was almost startling in its contrast. "Tell me what you need," he said simply. "Hold my arm when I lean out," she said. "And don't shift your weight suddenly." "Understood." The trunk was slick and cold through the soles of her boots. The water rushed beneath and around it with a sound like continuous thunder. Lily moved with her arms out for balance, reading the wood under her feet, feeling for the places where it was solid against the shelf below, and the places where it flexed. Caden followed 2 paces behind, his grip on her forearm steady and completely still. He had the physical discipline, she noted, of someone who understood that in situations like this, stillness was the most useful thing a strong man could offer. She reached the scout. Up close he was young, younger than she had expected, perhaps 20, with the kind of face that had not yet finished deciding what it wanted to look like. He had a gash above his left ear that had bled down the side of his face and dried dark. His lips were the particular gray-blue of someone who had been in cold water too long. "He needs to come out now," she said, loudly enough for Roman on the bank to hear. "Head first, upstream angle. If we pull him downstream, the current catches his legs." She looked at Caden. He nodded once. It took 4 minutes. Lily did not think about the cold water soaking through her cloak where she knelt on the partially submerged wood. She did not think about the dress that had cost 3 winters of savings getting ruined against the bark. She thought about the angle of the man's body, the position of his caught arm, the way the water pushed and where it would push harder if she made the wrong movement. Caden was exactly as useful as he had promised. Strong, still, and responsive to her direction without requiring explanations. She didn't have time to give. When they got the scout onto the bank, Roman was already there. He knelt beside the young man without hesitation, checking the injury at his temple with hands that moved quickly and without wasted motion. One of the soldiers produced a heavy wool blanket. Another had already started building a fire against the base of a large pine, working with the organized urgency of men who knew their tasks without being told. The scout's eyes opened. They were unfocused at first, cycling through the stages of cold and shock and confusion. And then they found Roman's face above him, and something in them steadied. "My king," he said, his voice barely above a rasp. "Still," Roman said. One word, but it carried everything. "You're safe. Stay quiet. It's over." Lily stood back and wrapped her soaking cloak around herself and watched Roman with the scout, and she thought about the way he had knelt without considering whether the ground was beneath his station. She thought about the word "still," and the way he had said it, and what it had done to the young man's face. Mara would have had a great deal to say about all of it. When Roman stood and turned, he looked at her across the fire that was beginning to catch and throw warmth into the frozen air between the trees. His expression was impossible to read in the way that deep water is impossible to read. You could see the surface clearly enough, but the depth defeated you. He crossed to where she stood. "You saved his life," he said. "The shelf saved his life," she said. "I just knew where it was." Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile, more like the acknowledgement of a quality he had encountered rarely enough to notice. "How do you know the Ashfen?" he asked. "You said the Western Territories. The Ashfen is not on any common road." She met his gaze. "I told you, I traveled alone. Alone means you learn the roads no one else takes." He was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled. Somewhere above them, through the canopy, the first pale suggestion of pre-dawn was beginning to thin the darkness. "Your scent," he said again, the same 2 words he had stopped himself on in the hall. This time he did not stop. "It carries a marker I have encountered only once before in my life." He paused. "A long time ago. Far from here." Lily felt something shift in her chest. "What marker?" Roman looked at her steadily. "The bloodline of the Ashwood," he said. "A lineage most people believe died out 20 years ago." The fire popped. A branch fell somewhere in the dark forest. The river roared on, indifferent, the way rivers do. Lily said nothing, but her hands, hidden inside the folds of her soaking cloak, had closed into fists. She did not sleep that night. The soldiers had made camp at a respectful distance from the river, setting up between the trees with the efficient silence of men who had done it in worse conditions. The scout, whose name, she learned, was Edric, had been wrapped in blankets near the largest fire and was already showing signs of recovery, the gray-blue fading from his lips, his breathing steadying into something that sounded less like effort and more like rest. One of Roman's men, a quiet older soldier with healer's hands, had cleaned and bound the wound at his temple with the practiced ease of long experience. Lily had been given a place near the fire, a dry blanket that smelled of pine resin and horse, and a cup of something hot that Caden had pressed into her hands without asking whether she wanted it. "Drink it," he had said. "It's not a suggestion." She drank it. It was some kind of bark tea, bitter and strong, and it chased the cold from her hands faster than the fire alone could manage. She sat with the cup and the blanket and watched the camp organize itself around her. And she thought about what Roman had said at the river's edge, the bloodline of the Ashwood. She had not said those words aloud in 4 years. She had not allowed herself to think them in anything louder than a whisper, the kind of internal whisper that you deliver to yourself at 3 a.m. when the pretending is too exhausting to maintain. She had built her life in Ashvale specifically on the absence of that name, on the carefully constructed anonymity of a woman who had arrived from the Western Territories with no family, no ties, and no history worth mentioning. She had been so thorough about it that she had almost convinced herself it was true. Almost. The Ashwood had been a ruling bloodline once. Not a pack in the ordinary sense. Something older than that. A lineage tied to the original compact between the Wolf Lords and the land itself. Back when the territories were young and the agreements that governed them were written in older ink than anyone still living could read. They had held the Western River Territories for 6 generations. And then, 20 years ago, when Lily had been 3 years old, and the world had not yet required her to understand what was happening, the Ashwood line had been systematically destroyed by a coalition of rival packs who had decided that an ancient bloodline with that kind of territorial claim was a threat they preferred to eliminate rather than negotiate with. Her mother had gotten her out. That was all Lily knew with certainty. All she had been told. All she had allowed herself to piece together from the fragments of memory that belonged to a 3-year-old. A woman's hands. The smell of smoke behind them. Running through trees in the dark. She had been raised by a healer in the far eastern villages. A woman who had asked no questions and offered no explanations. Who had died when Lily was 17 and left her with a small pack of traveling supplies, a knowledge of roots and remedies, and a silence on the subject of origins that was itself a kind of answer. She had spent the years since then moving, learning, becoming harder to find by becoming entirely unremarkable. And then the King of Ironvale had walked into a recognition ritual and stopped in front of her like a man who had caught the scent of something lost. "You're not sleeping." She looked up. Roman was standing at the edge of the firelight, his fur mantle gone, draped over Edric, she noticed, leaving him in the dark leather vest and crossed straps, his black braids loose from the ties they had been in earlier. Without the formal weight of the manto, he looked simultaneously less ceremonial and more dangerous, the way that powerful things sometimes look more powerful when stripped of their decoration. He sat down across the fire from her, without asking permission, which she was beginning to understand was simply how he moved through the world, not rudely, but with the quiet assumption of someone who has learned to take up space without apology. "No," she said. "I'm not sleeping." "The Ashwood," he said. Not a question this time. A door left open. She looked at the fire. "You said most people believe that bloodline died out." "Most people," he confirmed. "What do you believe?" He was quiet long enough that she looked up to find him watching her with that steady, winter water attention. "I believe," he said carefully, "that I am sitting across a fire from a woman whose scent carries a marker I last encountered when I was 19 years old, standing in the ruins of the Western River Fortress 3 days after the Coalition attack, trying to understand what had happened there. Something cold moved through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. You were there." "I arrived after," he said. "Ironvale was not part of the Coalition." He paused, and something in the set of his jaw tightened briefly. We were not consulted. We would not have agreed. She studied him. In the firelight, his face was all shadow and amber, the angles more pronounced. The scar she had noticed earlier, a thin line along his left jaw, more visible. He looked like a man telling the truth, but she had learned young that this was the least reliable indicator available. "Why does it matter?" she said. "What bloodline I carry. I'm an unranked Omega attached to a northern pack. The Ashwood territories have been redistributed for 20 years. The territories, yes, Roman said. But the compact is older than the territories. He met her gaze directly. A surviving heir of the Ashwood bloodline does not inherit land. She inherits standing, a seat at the Lord's Council, the right to make claims that override pack redistribution agreements. The fire crackled loudly in the silence that followed. That, Lily said slowly, is the kind of information that got my family killed. Yes, Roman said, without softening it. It is. She appreciated that. The absence of comfort where comfort would have been dishonest. Who else knows, she asked, that you suspected this, that you came north? Caden and Stellan, he said. No one else. He paused. I had been tracking the scent marker for 2 years. Reports from traders, from border soldiers, small things. A healer's assistant in the north who knew the old river crossings, who traveled alone, who appeared from nowhere 4 years ago. He looked at her steadily. I wasn't certain until tonight. 2 years. He had been looking for her for 2 years. She didn't know what to do with that information, so she set it aside, the way she set aside most things that were too large to process immediately, filed it in the back of her mind where it would wait until she had space and silence to examine it properly. What do you want? She said. From me. From this. It was the most direct question she had asked him, and she watched his face carefully when she asked it. There was something to be learned from the way powerful people responded to directness, whether they deflected, whether they performed, whether they calculated. Roman did none of these things. He simply considered the question with the same unhurried thoroughness he brought to everything else, and then he answered it. I want to bring you to Ironvale, he said. Under my protection. Formally. He paused. The coalition packs that destroyed your family are still active. 2 of them have new leadership, younger alphas who are more aggressive than their fathers were. If word reaches them that an Ashwood heir is alive and located, he stopped. Ashvale cannot protect you. This pack doesn't even know what it has. Lily thought about Elder Selva, who had always been pragmatic. She thought about Owen, who had looked at her and seen liability. She thought about 4 years of bowls of broth and loose bricks, and saved coins, and the careful, exhausting work of being invisible. And if I come to Ironvale, she said, what am I? Under your protection. What does that mean in practice? It means, Roman said, that anyone who wants to reach you goes through me first. The simplicity of it was almost startling. No elaborate political framing, no list of terms and conditions. Just that single, quiet line delivered with the absolute certainty of a man who had never once said something he didn't intend to follow through on. Caden's voice came from somewhere behind her, drowsy and completely without shame. He's been rehearsing that line for 2 years. For the record. Caden, Stellan said, from even further away. I'm asleep, Caden said immediately. Completely asleep. Didn't say anything. Lily looked at Roman. Roman looked at Lily. Something in his expression shifted. That fraction of movement at the corner of his mouth that she was beginning to recognize as the closest he came to visible amusement. It was, she thought, an entirely unfair thing to notice at a moment like this. I need to speak to Mara, she said, before I decide anything. She's the only person in Ashvale who... She stopped. She deserves to hear it from me. Of course, Roman said without hesitation. And I'm not going anywhere as a rescued orphan who needs carrying, she continued, because this felt important to establish clearly. If I come as myself. Whatever that means. He held her gaze. I would expect nothing else, he said. The fire settled into its quieter phase, the big logs burning down to steady coals that gave off more heat and less light. Above the tree canopy, the pre-dawn had deepened to a dark blue that was beginning its slow negotiation with the first gray of morning. Somewhere across the camp, Edric made a small sound in his sleep and shifted further into his blankets. Lily pulled her cloak around her shoulders and looked at the coals. She thought about her mother's hands, the smell of smoke running through trees in the dark. She thought about a 3-year-old who had grown into a woman who knew the false currents of dangerous rivers and how to move through the world without being found. She thought about Roman saying I would expect nothing else with that complete level steadiness that made her want to test it, in the way that people test the things they most want to be true. She did not sleep. But for the first time in a very long time, the wakefulness did not feel like hiding. It felt like something else entirely, something that hadn't had a name until tonight. She went back to Asheville at dawn. Roman rode with her, which she had not asked for, and which she did not refuse. Caden and Stellan remained at the river camp with the soldiers and Edric, who was well enough by morning to sit up and accept a bowl of broth with the relieved expression of a young man who has recently understood how close things came. The forest was different in the early light. The same trees, the same frozen mud beneath the horses' hooves, but stripped of the dramatic darkness that had made everything feel like the edge of something. Now it was simply cold and quiet and honest, the way mornings after significant nights tend to be. They rode without speaking for a long while. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that settles between people who have already said the important things and are allowing them to exist without further handling. Mara was waiting outside the healer's cottage when they arrived. Lily did not know how she knew to be there, whether someone had sent word, or whether Mara had simply spent the night awake and worried, and had eventually stationed herself at the door where she could intercept whatever came back from the direction of the river. It was entirely consistent with everything Mara had ever done. She stood with her arms crossed and her dark hair loose, and her expression cycling rapidly through relief, assessment, and a very pointed look at the large man on horseback beside Lily. Lily dismounted and crossed to her without preamble. I need to tell you something, she said. You need to tell me several things, Mara replied, her eyes still on Roman. Starting with who that is, which I already know, and ending with what happened at the river, which I don't. And somewhere in the middle, we will address the fact that you left a recognition ritual where Owen Farr publicly chose another woman and somehow ended up riding back at dawn next to the King of Iron Vale. That is an accurate summary, Lily said. I'm very good at summaries. They went inside. Roman remained with the horses, which Lily suspected he had assessed as the appropriate thing to do, and she was right. She sat with Mara at the small table near the healer's window with the gray morning light coming through the thick glass in pale, uneven squares, and she told her everything. The river, Edric, the words Roman had spoken at the fire, the Ashwood name said aloud for the first time in 4 years. Mara listened without interrupting, which cost her visibly. When Lily finished, the silence lasted long enough to be significant. Your mother, Mara said finally. Her voice was careful. You never told me. I didn't know how much was safe to tell, Lily said. Even here, even you. Mara absorbed this. Then she reached across the table and covered Lily's hands with her own. A gesture so familiar, so simply and completely Mara, that Lily felt the back of her throat tighten in a way she refused to indulge. Go, Mara said. Mara. Go, she repeated, firmer. You have been invisible in this pack for 4 years, and I have watched you make yourself smaller every single day, and I have never once said anything, because I didn't know what I was watching." She squeezed Lily's hands. "Now I know, and I'm telling you to go. I don't want to leave you here." "You're not leaving me," Mara said, with the particular patience of someone correcting a misunderstanding they find almost endearing. "You're leaving a pack that didn't deserve you. I am a person, not a place." She paused. "Besides," she allowed a small, precise smile, "Caden is extraordinarily handsome, and I would very much like an introduction before you go." Lily laughed. It came out of her suddenly and completely, the way laughter does when you haven't expected it, and it was real in the way that very few things had felt real in the last 12 hours. She held Mara's hands for another moment. Then she stood. She packed in less time than she would have thought possible. The truth was, she had always kept her life in Ashvale in a state of impermanence that she had told herself was practical and had never examined too closely. It took her one canvas pack and less than an hour. The coins behind the loose brick, the small knife she had carried since her traveling years, the book of remedies she had copied out herself in the healer's careful script, the dress, which she folded last and placed on top, the sand-colored linen with Mara's careful stitching, still holding its shape despite the evening it had survived. She kept it. She wasn't sure why. Perhaps because it represented something about the night that she wanted to remember accurately. Not the humiliation, but the fact that she had dressed for it anyway. That she had shown up. That she had not, in the end, let it be the last thing the night was about. Roman was still with the horses when she came out. He looked at the pack on her shoulder and said nothing, which was exactly right. Mara came out behind her and looked immediately and with great directness at Roman, who met her gaze with that steady, winter water calm. "If anything happens to her," Mara said, with the clarity of someone who has decided that rank is irrelevant to the present conversation, "I will find a way to make your life considerably more difficult. I don't know exactly how yet, but I will be creative." Roman considered this with apparent seriousness. "Understood," he said. Mara turned to Lily, hugged her once with the ferocity of someone who intends the gesture to last, and stepped back. "Send word when you arrive," she said. "I will. And tell Caden that the introduction he will inevitably request is conditional on good behavior." "I'll tell him." She mounted her horse. Roman mounted his. They rode out of Ashvale as the morning was fully establishing itself, the frost on the ground catching the early light and turning it briefly brilliant before the sun rose high enough to begin its slow work of undoing. Lily did not look back. Not because the leaving didn't matter, but because she had learned the difference between looking back from loss and looking back from grief, and this was neither. This was something she was choosing with her eyes open. They reached the river camp to find Edric sitting upright by the fire, engaged in what appeared to be a lively conversation with Caden that stopped abruptly when he saw Roman approaching, and he straightened with guilty speed. Caden showed no such instinct for self-preservation. "She came back," he announced, in a tone of profound satisfaction. "I see that," Stellan said from behind him, in a tone of profound relief. Edric looked at Lily with the direct, uncomplicated gratitude of a young man who had been at the bottom of a cold river 12 hours ago and understood perfectly well what that meant. He said nothing elaborate. He simply met her eyes and gave a single nod, the kind that carries more weight than sentences. She nodded back. They broke camp within the hour and rode south toward Iron Vale. The journey took 4 days, through terrain that changed gradually from the frozen northern forests to the wider, more open land of the Middle Territories, where the trees gave way to rolling ground and the sky became larger. Lily rode and watched and asked questions when she had them, which was often, and Roman answered with the same directness she had noted from the beginning. No flattery, no performance, just information delivered plainly. She learned the shape of Iron Vale through those 4 days of conversation, Its 7 packs, its council structure, the names of the alphas who would matter and the ones who required watching, the careful political architecture that Roman had spent a decade building, and that the presence of an Ashwood heir would complicate in ways both useful and dangerous. He told her the complicated parts too. She appreciated that most of all. On the 3rd night, when the camp was quiet and the fire had burned low, he told her about standing in the ruins of the western fortress at 19, the destroyed gates, the empty courtyards, the silence of a place that had been full of people 3 days before. He told it plainly and without drama, and she listened the same way. And somewhere in the telling and the listening, a thing was established between them that had no name yet, but that both of them recognized. On the 4th morning, Iron Vale came into view. It was larger than she had imagined. A fortress city built into the side of a granite ridge, its walls the same dark stone as the mountain behind it, its towers flying black banners that caught the wind with a sound like slow thunder. The gates were open, which she would learn was always the case during daylight hours, a deliberate signal that Roman had instituted in his first year as king, and maintained against the advice of 3 separate council members who felt it communicated insufficient threat. It communicates something better than threat, he had told them. She understood what he meant when she rode through those gates and felt the weight of the city around her. Not oppressive, but present. The specific gravity of a place that had been built to last and knew it. The council met 2 weeks later. Lily stood before 7 alpha lords in a hall of dark stone and candlelight, her gray cloak replaced by something better. Her Ashwood bloodline confirmed by the pack elder who had kept the lineage records for 40 years and who had gone very still when she entered the room. She made no claims she didn't intend to follow through on. She asked for the council seat that the compact entitled her to, and she made her case with the same directness that Roman had modeled and that she had discovered, over 4 days of riding south, was actually her own natural register. Not learned, just long suppressed. 3 lords agreed immediately. 2 required persuasion. 2 required the particular persuasion that Roman delivered with a single look and a silence that lasted just long enough to become instructive. The seat was granted. Owen Farr, she heard through Mara's letters, had realized within a week of the recognition ritual what he had done. He had gone to Elder Selva with some half-formed notion of appealing the ceremony. Selva had been, as always, pragmatic. The bond was declared. It stood. Selva had also, in her methodical way, begun to understand what the visit of the Iron Vale King to her pack's ritual meant, and had spent considerable energy in the months that followed, attempting to reframe the narrative of Lily's time in Ashvale in a way that suggested the pack had always recognized her value. Lily received these reports with equanimity. She bore no particular anger toward Owen anymore. He had been a man who chose safety over courage, and he would live with that choice the way people live with most of their choices, which was quietly and on ordinary days and usually fine. The anger had been real the night of the ritual. She had honored it. Then she had set it down and walked away from it, which was all it deserved. Mara arrived in Iron Vale 3 months after Lily, following an introduction to Caden that had been, by all accounts, neither brief nor marked by good behavior on either side. She came with 2 canvas packs, and the same dark hair, and the same expression of someone who misses nothing and comments on most of it. And Lily met her at the gates, and they stood in the morning cold and held on to each other in the way of people who have been friends through the particular difficulty of surviving. "Well," Mara said, pulling back and looking up at the fortress walls with the critical eye of a woman assessing whether a place deserves the person who has chosen it. "It's dramatic." "It is," Lily agreed. "I approve," Mara decided, conditionally. Roman was waiting in the courtyard. He looked at Lily with that steady, unhurried attention, the same look he had given her across the recognition hall, when she had been standing in a sand-colored dress with her chin up and everything carefully composed, and he had stopped walking as if the world had arranged something he had been patient enough to wait for. He crossed the courtyard to her. She met him halfway, which was, she had decided, exactly the right distance. They were bonded before the first snow of winter covered the Ironvale Ridge, not in ceremony, but in the quiet, irrevocable way of two people who have both learned to recognize the real thing and are no longer willing to settle for anything less. The council acknowledged it. The 7 packs acknowledged it. The Ashwood name was spoken aloud in the Great Hall, and it did not bring destruction. It brought, after 20 years of silence, the particular relief of a truth that has finally stopped waiting to be told. Edric recovered fully and joined the Ironvale Guard, where he distinguished himself within a year, and never, in all that time, passed a river crossing without stopping to read the current first. He said, when asked, that he had learned it from someone who knew that the most dangerous water was the kind that looked safe from the bank. Mara stayed. This surprised no one. Caden remained exactly himself, which was the best and most reliable thing about him. Stellan continued to be right about most things, and gracious enough not to mention it too often. And Lily, who had once tucked coins behind a loose brick and sewn hope into a dress that cost 3 winters of saving, who had learned the false currents of dangerous rivers and the particular skill of moving through the world without being found. Lily set down the long weight of invisibility and did not pick it up again. She had been seen by the right eyes, and that, in the end, was the only thing that had ever needed to happen.